Let's stay in the UK, and inflation here has hit a new 40-year high in September, climbing to 10.1%. The biggest jump in food prices since 1980 pushed British inflation back into double digits last month. Surging prices for food and non-alcoholic beverages were a major contributor to all of this, rising by 14.5%. The British pound slipped below 1.13 against the US dollar off the back of this inflation data. Meanwhile, many households are facing rising mortgage payments. That's after the Prime Minister Liz Truss's mini-budget last month sparked market volatility, especially in the bond markets. And due to the war in Ukraine, the UK has also been hit hard by a surge in natural gas prices right across Europe. That's adding to post-COVID supply chain bottlenecks and labour shortages. The new Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt, has said that the government will prioritise help for the most vulnerable. Well, let's go back to our London correspondent, Alex Isat, who's very patiently standing by for us. Alex, these new inflation figures out. What's the impact of this politically and also in terms of just everyday budgets for households right across the country?
Well, politically, it is what is driving down Liz Truss and her cabinet. She wanted to make this huge growth change, and it seems we are growing, but in not quite the way that she wanted. And of course, because of that mini budget, she had to change chancellors, and she has let herself down, really. She's getting rid of people, suggesting that she's still a strong leader. That's all now being seen as a potential backlash against her. Of course, the inflation rises were potentially going to go up anyway. The Bank of England had announced a couple of months back that they expected it to rise, but they didn't expect it to rise as fast as this. They also have said that they're expecting it to stay at this double figure level for at least a couple more months and potentially up to 2 years before it's going to be dropping down to what they perceive as 2% in interest rates. But when it comes to the political standpoint, ultimately Liz Truss really needs to use this PMQ that she's currently in to get that opposition behind her. We'll see when it comes to the fracking debate later whether they are behind her or not. And of course, the 1922 committee is meeting later, and that's again going to be discussing whether she should stay or go. And then we will see again the fiscal forecast on October 31st on Halloween. But for the average person, they're hearing all of these numbers, inflation's rising, what about interest rates? And ultimately it comes down to their cost of living is going to continue to get worse. They have been paying out for costs of food, costs of fuel, and it's household costs, those bills that we've been talking about, and the cost of food that is really pushing that purse. People's wages aren't going up with inflation, so that means that they don't have as much money as they'd like to be able to spend on frivolous things like eating out. So they have to try and focus on what they want to spend their hard-earned money on, because it doesn't look like wages will be going up at all. We're still going to keep an eye out to see whether benefits will go up and pensions will go up in line with inflation. Of course, Liz Truss did mention there in PMQs that the triple lock will stay. So that does suggest that pensions will go up in line with inflation, which also could have a more detrimental, damaging effect on the amount of money that's coming out of the government's purse. And that money needs to be gained from somewhere. So it's likely we're going to see interest rates hike again and costs go quite through the roof. So for the average person, they're going to feel this quite heavily, and especially as we head into winter when more people are turning on their electricity and turning on their gas.
Yeah, Alex, always worth remembering that this data has an impact on people's lives and on their bills, etc. Thanks very much. That was our London correspondent, Alex Isat. All right, let's get some more analysis on this from Craig Earlham, who's a senior market analyst at Wonder, and he's joining us live from London. Craig, in particular, that new inflation data ticking up again, once again. What's the impact been on the markets here in the UK and on the pound sterling?
It's been pretty minimal so far. The pound sterling is still under some pressure. It's off just shy of 1% today. But obviously it has rebounded quite strongly over the course of the last week or so with those budget reversals. In terms of the markets themselves, I mean, as far as interest rates are concerned, the markets are still pricing in around 1.75% of rate hikes by the end of the year. So over the course of the next two meetings, either coming from a 1% hike at the start of November and then 75 basis points in December, or the other way around. Either way, markets expect interest rates or the bank rate at the end of this year to be 4% from 2.25% now. So quite a stark change, really, at a time of double-digit inflation, in the hope that the bank can try and get this under control and maybe takes into 2023 on a slightly more positive footing. But there's no doubt that the economic pressures on households and businesses for the foreseeable future are going to remain immense.
And just in terms of the inflation data that we've had at the start of this kind of crisis, what we were seeing was a lot of talk from economists about this being sort of temporary inflation, that it would drop back down pretty quickly. What are you seeing in terms of inflation forecasts for the next 6, 9, 12 months?
Well, I think first and foremost, it's quite clearly become far more ingrained, and that's because of a number of different factors, one of which is higher fuel prices over the course of this year means that that's now factored through to end prices. Companies are facing higher costs. They were facing higher costs already because of supply chain issues as a result of the pandemic. Then they were facing higher energy costs as a result of the aftermath of the pandemic, but also then the war in Ukraine. And then this is starting to be passed increasingly through to consumers. So it means that the scale of the inflationary pressures aren't just now fuel and other energy costs. It's actually far more broad-based. And that's the biggest concern for the Bank of England, because that's when it has the more chance of becoming sticky and ingrained and become a multi-year problem rather than a multi-month problem, which is what they initially thought it was going to be. In terms of what that means for expectations going down the road, it means that the Bank of England and other central banks are going to have a very difficult job on their hand. It's going to take longer to get inflation back to target and to adjust the mindsets of households and businesses around the country, which is what makes this job so incredibly difficult, and why central banks feared what has now happened actually happening over the course of this year. So yeah, I think it's going to be a slow path back to target. I think over the course of the next 12 months, I think we could see inflation maybe half, but I don't think it's peaked yet. That's the problem. The inflation peak is likely to come later this year, early next, and depending on what happens with energy bills in April, after the changes announced by Chancellor Jeremy Hunt, then that will determine just what the peak will ultimately be, and therefore what the path back to target's going to be and how long that's going to take. There's so many different factors at play ultimately, and that's before we even get into the fact that the big unknown, which is the war in Ukraine and how long that's ultimately going to last.
All right, thanks very much for that, Craig. That was Craig Erlam with some analysis on the new inflation data here in the United Kingdom.